Morning arrived in a pale half-light that made the Meridian Gallery's glass frontage resemble a veiled face. Mr. Pemberton let himself in with the little ritual that had ordered his days for 30 years. Umbrella to the stand, keys laid neatly on the ledge, the unhurried turn of the lock that allowed the street to fall away like a tide withdrawing from stone steps. The air within was cool and faintly scented with beeswax and the last of last night's lilies. He paused, as he always did, to listen. Buildings, like people, had their cadences. The gallery at rest murmured very softly. He drew the blinds in the vestibule and crossed into the main room where the canvases waited with an odd patience. Lights first, then temperature, then the careful straightening of chairs. A program lay on the floor, folded along a new crease. He smoothed it and replaced it at the end of the bench beneath the central painting. The girl who left no footprints glimmered intact, its glass without smudge. On the frame's lower edge, a small red disc, yesterday's proof of sale, sat slightly askew. Pemberton, whose eye for rightness was a thing of pride, adjusted it with a gentle pressure. It was only when he turned towards the side gallery, the one Lady Cordelia preferred for her private consultations, that he noticed the faintest stir in the air. Not a draught. The window there admitted none when locked. Rather a sense, like heat that lingers after a candle has been pinched, of recent human presence. He went on, soundless on the parquet, and saw her. She sat on the small chaise as though in obedience to a request to remain just so for a minute. Miss Vivienne Castleton wore the dove grey of the previous evening, the colour receding into the room's coolness, her face turned slightly away. One glove had been removed and lay like a folded moth on the chaise beside her. On the low table, a glass with a clouded inch of water and, beside it, a tiny crystal flask with its stopper set neatly upright, like a polite guest. "Miss?" Pemberton's voice, kept to its courteous register, did not carry far. He drew closer and set the back of his hand to the air near her mouth, as he had once seen a doctor do. The stillness before him had a quality beyond sleep. He stood a moment, for he had his own rituals about such things, and then he went to the telephone. Lady Cordelia came quickly, her calm like a shawl thrown over shock. She moved to the chaise without touching it, as if a thread ran between respect and dread and must not be snapped. "She must have stayed," she said, not as speculation, but with the ache of someone rejecting surprises. "After we left. How could that—" "The side door was bolted when I arrived, my lady," Pemberton answered. "The same as always. The front locks were as I left them. I think she was here when I closed last night. I did not see her." The statement, modestly delivered, was exact. It seemed to diminish him that it could be true. Dr. Marcus Whitfield entered with his bag, that battered extension of his hand which had comforted and deceived so many. He made the usual sounds one makes around the dead, the small sigh that accepts rather than resists, and then, very quietly, said, "She is quite gone." He looked at the glass and the tiny bottle, lifted neither. "We will do what is proper," he added. "There need be no upset." Lady Cordelia's gaze moved, with effort, to the painting in the main room and returned. She would have hated noise, she said. The words might have been about Vivian, or about the gathering sorrow that pressed at the door. On the floor, near the leg of the chaise, a single white petal lay as if dropped in passing by someone who did not stop to notice. Pemberton, whose mornings included the removal of yesterday's flowers, thought, without at first knowing why, that he could not account for a white bloom in this room. Last night's arrangements had been peonies and tulips in shades of wine. He looked again and did not stoop. "Call Inspector Alleyn," Lady Cordelia said at last. "He was here last night. He will know how not to make a spectacle." "Of course, my lady." Pemberton moved to the telephone again, his fingers steady in the way that comes when steadiness is the only gift one can offer. In the hall, the clock that he wound each morning struck the half-hour with considerate discretion. The gallery, which had been a theatre and a chapel both, held its breath. Outside, a milk cart passed, its wheels writing a quiet message on wet street. Within, the painting of the girl who left no footprints reflected nothing but the room, and the room revealed nothing that would raise its voice. Morning came pale and veiled, with a sort of fog that London cultivates like a garden. The Meridian Gallery, shuttered and self-possessed after its late hours, received it with the discreet resignation of an old house resigning itself to a caller it cannot turn away. Mr. Pemberton, who had known more dawns seen from doorways than he cared to number, stood a moment on the steps with his keys in hand and listened to the silence. It had weight, that silence, as if the night had not so much passed as lingered. He opened the door and stepped into the cool interior. The low lamps, left burning for security, spread an even wash across the cream walls, flattening the shadows so that every canvas looked newly hung. He moved with habitual care to the switchboard and brought up the gallery lighting in stages, the way one wakes a delicate child. From the corridor behind him came the faint scuff of Mrs. Bligh's soles. She too had arrived early, her bucket riding on its wheels like a small, compliant animal. "Morning, Mr. Pemberton," she said under her breath, as if the paintings might be offended by anything louder. "Morning, Mrs. Bligh." He did not turn. His attention had gone to the far wall and to the one picture that drew his eye, whether he willed it or not. The girl who left no footprints floated above its little crescent of velvet cord, commanding the space with its pale composure. Something about the angle of the protective glass struck him as not quite itself, a fraction of a degree that would have escaped anyone less in love with the place. He crossed the room with the quiet efficiency of an old campaigner and paused. The settee opposite the painting, an elegant, pale piece on slender legs, had been moved an inch back from its usual position. He knew because his hands had measured that position twice a week for years, and because old men of his sort possessed the sort of memory that is muscle rather than mind. Upon the settee a young woman sat, head tilted as if listening, her hands folded in her lap. "Miss?" said Mrs. Bligh softly, peering past his shoulder. "Oh." He lifted a hand to still her. The dove-grey silk, the reflective pallor, the neat gloves placed together like a decision. These he took in before he permitted himself to see the face. It was Miss Vivian Castleton. Her eyes were closed and would not be opened. Her lips carried the faintest suggestion of some unspeakable taste, though whether that were fancy or knowledge he could not have said. One hand had loosened and allowed a slender envelope to tilt and rest against the pleat of her skirt. It bore no address. Pemberton looked down at the floor. The parquet had been polished the previous afternoon until it confessed the light. Now it confessed nothing. No smudge, no mark, no thread of damp, no betrayed grain suggested the path she had taken to reach that place. The little crescent of cord had been unhooked and hooked again, neat as a habit. Behind them, Mrs. Bligh's breath found a shallow, frightened rhythm. "You will not touch, Mrs. Bligh," he said, as if the instruction were part of her employment. "You will go to Lady Cordelia's number and inform her very quietly. Then you will ring for a doctor, and then—" He allowed himself a pause that acknowledged the world beyond the gallery, with all its necessary inexorabilities. Then the yard. Mrs. Bligh went, grateful to be given something useful to do. Pemberton remained where he was, his hands lightly clasped behind him. He had seen births and marriages and a few deaths, some tidy, some not. This one had about it a curious propriety, as if the girl had elected to become part of the composition she had inspired. He looked up at the painting, at the white figure poised above sand, incapable of witnessing her passage, and felt, as he had not felt in many years, the uncomfortable proximity of art and fate. Lady Cordelia arrived first, her chauffeur having been roused from a private disapproval of early mornings. She entered quickly and then stopped, the way one stops in a church when one has forgotten to bless oneself. Her gaze went from Mr. Pemberton to the settee and fixed there. She took off her gloves and then, as if remembering herself, put them back on before speaking. "Was she alone when you found her?" she asked quietly. "Yes, my lady." "Has anyone—" "No, my lady." They did not look at the envelope. They did not speculate aloud. The gallery's air, conditioned for canvases rather than people, moved imperceptibly. Somewhere, a street organ tried 2 notes and gave up. The doctor came at a reasonable speed and with a reasonable face. He stepped to the settee, made his careful, professional obeisances to life and to death, and then drew back with a small inclination of the head that assented to the inevitable. He said something about time and about the absence of struggle. He did not say what had done it. He would write that later with a pen that did not tremble. "Inspector Alleyn," said Lady Cordelia at last, turning to Mr. Pemberton not as a servant but as a repository of sense. "Would you—" "I have already asked for him, my lady," said Pemberton, who had telephoned the Yard as one might consult an oracle and felt oddly comforted to have done so. "He was here last night." "So he was," she murmured, looking again at the painted beach and at the girl who had, it seemed, kept her promise. "He will see what there is to see." Alleyn arrived without fanfare, a tall, correct figure whose presence seemed to steady the gallery's trembling hush rather than disturb it. Pemberton met him with the quiet relief of a man who had done what could be done and now surrendered the rest to someone whose manner implied, without declaring, that order might be coaxed out of horror. "If you please, sir," Pemberton murmured, and led him to the alcove. Alleyn paused at its threshold. The air held the same faint blend Pemberton had noticed, beeswax, dried roses, and that elusive metallic sweetness that stood just beyond definition. The painting presided, the white figure poised mid-step over reflective sand, unmarking the world as she passed. Beneath it, Vivian Castleton sat like an echo brought to earth, her head tipped, her hand resting on the frame as though she sought permission to vanish. He let the scene settle into him before he moved. He noted the velvet rope, unhooked, then returned to its brass eye with punctilious care. The brass itself showed a minute fog of recent handling, an oval dulling no larger than a fingertip. On the parquet, the minute ridges left by the previous day's polishing still lay undisturbed in their regular drift. There was no muddle of scuffs, no haste recorded in the wood's patient memory. "Did you touch anything beyond, as you've told me?" Alleyn asked, not looking up. "No, sir. I checked her wrist and went to the telephone." "Quite." He crouched, his body arranging itself with economical grace, and looked at the fallen curve of silk. A thread at the hem was darkened, not by dust, but by a faint tackiness. Beeswax. He thought and filed it away with the polished fog on the brass. In her right hand, the fingers had closed about a small silver locket. The chain was broken. Where the link had parted, the metal shone with that raw brightness which exposure dims within hours. The clasp lay turned inward, concealing any monogram. He did not disturb it. The locket's edge bore a film, the merest breath of print or powder, too faint to read here. He straightened, eyes going to the painting's lower frame. A tiny snag in the gilded moulding, fresh to the eye if one had a mind to such matters, no more than a whisper of scraped gold leaf. "She was here last night," he said, and only then glanced at Pemberton. "You closed at what hour?" 10:30, sir. Her ladyship's guests had gone by then, those who required seeing off. I made my round. Miss Castleton was not present. And this morning, 7:45. As is my habit. Alleyn's gaze moved to the alcove's corners, the panel joins, the skirting board. A paper-thin curl of something lay by the plinth's base. He took it on his palm, the brittle petal of a dried rose, crushed at one edge as though trapped beneath a shoe and freed again. He set it down where it had been. "Keys?" he said. "Mine." Pemberton replied. Her ladyship's. Mr. Ashford has a set for emergencies. He is trustee for certain matters. The framer holds none. The electrician comes only by appointment. You met no one on your way in? No, sir. Lady Cordelia appeared then, her black silk and the fragrance she wore bringing with them a composed grief that neither asked for nor refused sympathy. She did not at first look at the body, but at the painting, and Alleyn noticed how deliberately, after a measured count of seconds, she lowered her gaze to the woman at its foot. "Inspector," she said. "Thank you." He inclined his head. "I'm sorry." She came nearer, stopping at the rope as if by instinct. Vivienne was not robust, she said, each word placed with care on its own simple dignity. There were fainting fits. Dr. Whitfield has spoken of them. Of course. Alleyn's tone made no argument. You spoke to her after the guests dispersed? I did not. A fractional pause. I asked Helena to take her home. She seemed drifted. Mrs. Marchmont did so. I believe she did. Lady Cordelia's eyes did not move to Pemberton. Helena telephoned me from her flat in Chelsea at 11. She said Vivienne was resting. Alleyn let that too, rest. He took in the absence of a wrap or gloves. It had been a damp cold last night. Even a young woman would have worn something against it. No small handbag lay within sight. No handkerchief had been set aside. The alcove contained precisely what it meant to. The painting, the plinth, the polished floor, and the still figure who had come without announcing her need. Sir, Pemberton said, quietly. The rope, when I found it. It was as you see now. Yes. Alleyn's eyes returned to the brass hook, to the small, dull oval. In his mind, he saw the measured hand that hooked it back, not to deceive so much as to keep faith with a ritual. He looked at Vivienne's face then, serene past the possibility of artifice, and felt, beneath his habit of courtesy, something like anger at the tidy composure of it. He stepped back at last. We'll go slowly, he said, to no one in particular, and perhaps to the room itself. Mr. Pemberton, if you would arrange a quiet corner and hot tea. Her ladyship, may I ask you to remain within call? I'll have the police surgeon presently. Until he comes, we will observe. He turned once more to the painting. The girl in white moved forward without trace. Beneath her, painted water gave back everything but her passage. Alleyn's gaze shifted to the living floor and its immaculate polish. He smiled without mirth and did not yet ask the questions pressing to be spoken. Alleyn began with Lady Cordelia, in the small office behind the reception desk, a room whose tasteful austerity suggested that art was to be served rather than enjoyed. Through the glazed door, the gallery's hush persisted like a pressure system. Lady Cordelia sat with her gloves still on, as though disarmament might be unseemly. You allowed Miss Castleton to remain after the viewing, Alleyn said, his tone social rather than official. I did, she returned, meeting his gaze with the fortitude of a woman accustomed to arranging other people's tragedies. She wished for quiet. She had grown increasingly attached to that one canvas. Well, to Edmund's vision of her. Did she name her expected visitor? No. She merely said the gallery would have one more guest before it slept. A small pause. It sounded theatrical. Edmund encouraged that in his sitters. Keys? Alleyn glanced at the hook board where 2 brass tags were conspicuous in their moderate shine. Pemberton holds the master. I have the duplicate. The night porter, when we employ one, uses a temporary key, but last night there was none. Telephone? Lady Cordelia's glance flickered to the instrument. The line was used at 8:55. Mr. Pemberton called a car. There were no other calls from this room. She hesitated. We do not keep a log. This is a gallery, Inspector, not a barracks. James Ashford entered unbidden, the manner of an heir who has learned that doors yield to his hand. A revolting business, he said briskly. You will find it was her own doing. This kind of death loves an audience, even if supplied after the fact. He smiled, an effort that didn't reach his eyes. "Forgive me. I speak from horror." "Of course," Alleyn said gently. "Did you see Miss Castleton leave last night?" "I left before 11. She was still hovering. Helena was with her. There was talk. Girlish confidences over art. I take no interest." Lady Cordelia's gloves tightened. Helena saw her safely to the alcove and returned for her wrap. After that, I cannot say. Helena Marchmont received Alleyn in the alcove itself, her profile turned to its painted counterpart. "I have been told not to touch," she said, with the faintest curve of irony. "How accustomed we become to the prohibitions of reverence." "You were the last to sit with Miss Castleton?" "I imagine so." She spoke of calm, of finishing a conversation she had begun with Edmund. Helena faced him then, lovely and strained. "I have no patience with the sentimental view of artists, Inspector. Edmund was exacting and occasionally cruel. Because the work demanded it. Vivian mistook that cruelty for intimacy." Cruelty. He taught people to see themselves without the comforts they preferred. Some do not survive such instruction. She drew a breath. "If you are asking whether I resented her, I will say this. I resented the haste with which youth believes itself chosen. And last night, I left her where you found her, almost there, in attitude if not in fact. She asked me for a handkerchief and then did not take it." Helena looked past him to the gilded frame. "I wore Rose Absolue, if that is what you are detecting. It clings to fabrics and memory." Professor Aldrich Thornton, buttoned into his elderly severity like a tutor's gown, proved both forthright and unhelpful. "You will be tempted to assign motive to aesthetic debate," he said. "Resist it. Aesthetic debate is a polite name for appetite. Miss Castleton was a beautiful hypothesis. Hypotheses provoke ownership." "By whom?" "By all of us," Thornton replied dryly. "By money, by grief, by the fervor of the critic, by the fatigue of the model. As for practicalities, I left at 10:20. Miss Marchmont and Lady Cordelia remained. Mr. Ashford had already made himself elsewhere." Dr. Whitfield, summoned to the office after his examination, maintained his professional scruple. "Her melancholy was significant. I prescribed nothing dangerous. If poison is suspected, it did not come from my hand." "Had she enemies?" Alleyn asked. "Not of the theatrical breed. She feared forgetting her sister," Whitfield said. "That is not an enemy. It is an erosion." "Was anyone aware of this expected visitor?" "Not from me," he said. "She did not confide in doctors. We stand too near the mechanisms." Sir Reginald Pembroke, the critic, presented himself as if rehearsed. "Inspector, I left before the serious weeping began. I avoid scenes. They read as cheap realism." His thin smile tilted. "You'll find no villainy among connoisseurs, only preferences." Alleyn let these voices settle like dust in an undisturbed room. He returned to the alcove and found Pemberton stationed there, hands folded, gaze lowered with a care that looked like loyalty and felt like omission. "Mr. Pemberton," Alleyn said lightly, "the gallery has its habits. I should be obliged if you told me one that failed last night." Pemberton's eyes lifted and fell. "I will consider, sir." Alleyn accepted the deferral. In places where propriety held the floor, truth often waited in the wings, patient as a servant who had seen more than he intended to say. Alleyn asked, with Lady Cordelia's assent, that the household staff be sent in one by one. It was not bullying he sought, only the unstudied truth that slips through when rank is absent and habit speaks. The morning room's soft light flattened distinctions and made confidences seem a kind of housekeeping. Mr. Vale, the butler, entered with the grave composure of an old church. He was narrow, beautifully brushed, and determinedly neutral. "I was on duty at the gallery last evening, sir, to assist with the list," he said. "Lady Cordelia desired a discreet door. Miss Castleton remained when the guests departed." "By arrangement," Alleyn said. Indeed, sir. Mr. Pemberton held the keys. Vale's eyes were respectful and opaque. At 10:20, a messenger brought a small parcel, brown paper tied with string, for Miss Castleton. She had asked for quiet receipt. I took it to Mr. Pemberton, who delivered it. What return address? None, sir. The string was of the common kind. Miss Castleton thanked Mr. Pemberton, and the matter ended, so far as I observed. Vale would say no more, not out of insolence, but from the professional modesty of a man who believed speculation vulgar. He withdrew like a curtain closing, leaving behind the faint suggestion of something carefully placed out of sight. Mrs. Bligh, the housekeeper, came with clean, folded hands. She had the air of one who knew where everything belonged and disliked to see grief making a muddle. Miss Castleton visited you here on Monday? Alleyn asked. For tea, sir, and nothing improper. A quiet young lady. She admired the Chinese tea caddy. She was, if I may, hollowed out, like a house after moving day. Mrs. Bligh paused. This morning I found a dried rose stem in the small basket outside her ladyship's boudoir. We do not keep such things. It was unusual. Last night's scent lingers, even in waste paper, Alleyn said mildly. Mrs. Bligh's glance flickered. If one cares to notice, sir. Pemberton, summoned from the gallery, brought with him that air of institutional silence which is not secrecy, but craft. He stood just within the threshold, hat in hand, and composed the facts as he would have straightened a frame. My practice is to lock the side door in the mews at 11, he said. I use a wooden match to test the latch from the inside. If it draws clean, the match snaps. This morning it had been pressed and slid. No snap. The latch held, but not in my fashion. A small matter. Small matters built temples, Alleyn murmured. The lights? I extinguished the alcove lamps right to left, sir. On entering today, the second lamp from the right was fractionally askew. The velvet rope under the girl who left no footprints had its plaque turned inward. I turn it outward for the polishers. A trifle. Yet trifles are what I am for. And the parcel Monsieur Vale mentioned. A cardboard carton, sir. I delivered it to Miss Castleton. She opened it privately. Later, I found a coil of brown paper string on the floor by the plinth. I put it in my pocket against tripping. It is at the gallery, should you wish it. He hesitated, the discretion of years refining his reluctance. Mr. Pemberton, Alleyn prompted. There was a bloom of rose scent in the alcove that did not belong to the night's end, he said. It was fresh when I arrived, and yet no flowers were present. Miss Dalrymple, Lady Cordelia's secretary, proved to be a tall young woman with earnest hands and a mind arranged in files. She spoke quickly, then corrected herself, then apologized for speed, all without moving from the precise line of propriety. Miss Castleton wrote to ask for solitary viewing, she said. Lady Cordelia consented. I sent reminders to the lenders. Dr. Whitfield telephoned at 9 to confirm Miss Castleton was steady. He used that word. At 10, Miss Marchmont's maid telephoned to ask whether the gallery kept a side entrance open for sitters. I said no. Mr. Pemberton attends to that exclusively. Name of the maid? Martin, sir. A Frenchwoman. She said Madame's hem had caught in a taxi door and would be late to collect a wrap left in the cloakroom. I suggested the morning. Thomas Mason, Lady Cordelia's chauffeur, stood as straight as his cap peak permitted. His speech was plain and unembroidered. I drove her ladyship home, he said. On returning for Mr. Ashford, I took the mews for the turn. A motor was standing with lamps doused near the side gate. Couldn't swear to the make. I thought it odd. A person stepped out by the gate. Could be a lady. Small, in a light coat. Went in quick. It was 11:30. Alleyn didn't press. He watched their silences rather than their faces, the way each paused just before an admission, like a hand held steady a second too long before replacing a crystal glass. Routine had been nudged. Somewhere in those careful small departures lay the shape of intent, waiting to be revealed by a question not yet asked. Alleyn returned to the Meridian in the late afternoon, when the city's light thinned to pewter and the gallery prepared itself for evening's cultivated hush. He asked Pemberton, with the civility that never felt contrived, to take him through the closing ritual as though nothing untoward had occurred. The old man complied without question, and in the steady unfolding of his motions, draw curtain, check, latch, dim lights to level 5, clip rope with brass medallion outward, Alleyn found the vocabulary of a place that spoke most clearly in habit. "Invariably 5, he asked, indicating the dimmer. "Invariably, sir," said Pemberton. "The works show best just there. Mr. Hartwell insisted on it." Alleyn examined the dial in the alcove of the central painting. It rested at 3. The light had been lowered to a softer, more flattering shadow, the kind that smooths faces and dissolves edges. It was an alteration so minor it could pass as accident, yet Pemberton's world admitted few accidents. "And the rope?" Pemberton unclipped and reclipped the velvet barrier with the neat economy of a conjurer. "Medallion outward. I've done it so these 30 years. He glanced, almost apologetically, at the brass that bordered the girl who left no footprints. This morning it faced inward, not slovenly, merely wrong. Alleyn's eye followed the gilt frame's lower edge. There, beaded along a bead, no more than the head of a pin, lay a tremor of beeswax, the tiniest fleck that even Pemberton's polish had missed. He touched it with a match end and found it new enough to mark, old enough to have set tackily. A thin thread of silver, chain bright, adhered where a hand might have passed and been caught. He thought of the broken locket in the dead girl's palm and the way her fingers had rested on the frame, not as ornament, but as anchor. "She would never lean," Pemberton murmured, hearing the direction of his thought. "Miss Castleton was always most careful. Yet, well..." He did not finish. In a house of art, one learns not to finish. "The floor runners?" Alleyn asked. Pemberton hesitated, then opened a narrow press behind the alcove. Within lay 2 linen strips rolled with blue tape. He lifted them as though they were altar linen. "When we must step beyond the rope, we lay these. No scuffing then. One does it rarely. Only if touching the hanging is necessary." "One was used," Alleyn said, because the edges told him so. Fibers lay minutely raised where a roll should have been smooth. A faint crescent stain, no larger than a thumbprint, darkened the hem. To his nose it brought roses and something warmer, heavier, a perfume that did not belong in Pemberton's neutral air. "Not lavender," Pemberton said softly. "Not lavender," Alleyn agreed. "And this..." He passed his hand over the linen's far end and caught a dust so fine it glinted. Mica, perhaps, that faint cosmetic sparkle which clings like a memory and refuses dismissal. They stood for a moment with the runners between them like petitioners. Alleyn replaced the roll with care and turned to the service door. Its latch clicked with decorous finality when he said it properly. "You found it not quite home?" "Just so, Inspector. It's a trick catch. If you don't press twice, it feigns obedience." He demonstrated, and Alleyn heard the false assent, and the true one following, the second a degree deeper, the sound of something completing. "Who knows the runners are kept there?" Alleyn asked, not as challenge but as polite curiosity. "Staff," Pemberton replied. "Mr. Hartwell, of course. Lady Cordelia. Miss Marchmont has seen me place them. She posed for a hand study that needed adjusting. Dr. Whitfield would have no cause. The professor neither." "In the pantry," Alleyn said later to Mrs. Pemberton. "Your tray for 2. She showed him the cut-glass lemon dish, the short spoons, the teacups dried and replaced. "She took sugar last night," the woman said. "She never did before. 2 lumps. They left 1 spoon unmarked." "Unmarked?" he repeated. "Unused, I mean. No tea-ring. The saucer beneath it shows a little spot of something that wouldn't wash. I kept it. Some scents leave trace." She produced the saucer like a shy conspirator. At its rim, a transparent crescent had dried to hardness. He lifted it to his nose. Roses again, and beneath, that same warmer note, an insistence that suggested intention. He returned to the alcove and stood where the dead girl had sat. The dimmer at 3, the rope wrong way out, the runners rolled back with their secret gleanings. Each was a courtesy to the floor, to the painting, to the hush. Someone had crossed that forbidden space as a matter of form, not haste. Someone who regarded ritual not as barrier, but as map. He drew the curtain halfway, as Pemberton would for dusting, and watched the light change the painted sea. The girl in white advanced without mark, as though the ground complied. The gallery had complied too, he thought. It had made way for a visitor who knew how to leave nothing behind but a scent and the faintest glimmer. When he left, he asked that nothing be altered, not even the errant medallion. He had seen enough to know that the smallest courtesies would point the way. The next disturbance, he suspected, would come as softly as the first. The day withdrew upon itself with that peculiar inwardness London achieves toward late afternoon. The meridian, emptied of visitors, returned to its cultivated stillness. Alleyn remained in the small office behind the galleries, where the ledger-scented quiet seemed to assist thought. He had been reviewing, with the patience of a copyist, the faint ridges left on the polished parquet and the minute abrasions upon brass. Ritual's ledger, as it were, when Mr. Pemberton tapped and entered with the morning's misdirected post, belatedly rescued from a side table. "This was addressed to Miss Castleton, Inspector," he said, "delivered with the newspapers and overlooked in the upset." The envelope, thick and cream, bore Lady Cordelia's monogram impressed in a pale oval. The flap had been sealed and then opened with the care of a person who knew how to disturb wax without fracturing the crest. A faint breath of roses rose from it, not garden roses, but that concentrated dusky fragrance Helena Marchmont had named, without prompting, Rose Absolue. "With Lady Cordelia's permission," Alleyn said, and Pemberton, already anticipating this, placed a neatly penned authorization upon the desk. Inside lay a single sheet, folded twice. The fold was incorrect. Lady Cordelia's secretary, as Alleyn had noticed when glancing through condolence correspondence earlier, always folded with the monogram outward and the final quarter turned toward the right. A small, efficient ritual. This sheet had been turned inward and to the left. The hand, too, was not the secretary's. It was a graceful, uncertain script, its loops narrow, its terminals faintly tremulous, as though the writer had tried to imitate another. The message, in that measured hand, read, "Come at 9:30 by the service door. Bring the locket. You will understand at last. Do not tell Pemberton. E." Alleyn sat with the letter for some time, letting the peculiarities settle into their proper weight. The rose scent persisted, elusive and unmistakable. He held the paper up to the light. The watermark matched Lady Cordelia's paper. A small smear at the lower margin suggested the writer had paused with the pen's nib resting. The ink was green-black, the old-fashioned iron gall kind that left a faint bronze sheen when dry. He remembered Professor Thornton's notes in the exhibition catalogue bearing that same metallic whisper along their strokes. He returned the sheet to its envelope and asked Pemberton to show him the service entrance again. On the inner jamb, the faintest crescent of wax clung, as if a seal had brushed it in passing. The rug just inside bore no footprint. Pemberton's nightly sweeping left those minute uniform ridges. But at its border, a single grain of pale sand shone like an off-key note. The gallery contained sand in only one place, on one canvas, under a girl who left none. "That grain," Alleyn said. "You did not notice it this morning?" "I confess I did not, sir. One thinks of dust as democratic. This is specific." He found Lady Cordelia at home and placed the letter on a tray between them. She examined it without touching the paper, her restrained gaze meeting his afterward with weary candor. My stationery, not my hand. Vivian had access, of course, when she rifled those older files. Others, too, on occasion. Dr. Whitfield called yesterday in some agitation. James is careless with desks. Helena knows the house. But the initial E, Alleyn said, offered without persuasion. Edmund, Eleanor. Her composure faltered and then returned to its accustomed poise. It is a cruelty either way. At that moment the butler entered with a card. Professor Aldrich Thornton waited below, having insisted that his business could not be deferred. He came in with a stiff correctness that suggested old injuries borne upright, and stood, hat in hand, before the mantel. Inspector, Lady Cordelia, I have been remiss. The police like chronology, do they not? I came last night to deposit with you a manuscript Edmund entrusted to me. I did not find you in. I left a note with your hall boy. It seems to have melted into some domestic oubliette. His eyes, severe behind their lenses, flicked once to the envelope on the tray, then away, as if obeying a private rule. I understand Miss Castleton is dead. Yes, Lady Cordelia said. Quietly. The professor's mouth tightened. She was not suited to ambiguity. Edmund enjoyed it. I warned him. When Alleyn, as gently as a man can, asked if the professor used iron gall ink, Thornton gave a short assent. Have done for 40 years, the modern fluids are vulgar in their eagerness. A pause followed that admitted both implication and its refusal. The professor's gloved hand, thin kid, fastidious as his prose, rested upon the chair back and then withdrew as if contact troubled him. It was Helena Marchmont who provided the day's second disturbance without entering the room at all. Troy telephoned, her voice low and self-possessed, to report that Helena had failed to appear for rehearsal and had sent to the theatre a short note of withdrawal, typed, unsigned, with a pressed rose laid in the envelope as if to compensate for the absence of a name. A rose? Alleyn repeated. A small, brittle thing, and her dresser swears Madame never relinquishes the stage before a third-act applause. It's not like her. He thanked Troy and replaced the receiver. The air about them seemed to alter by imperceptible degrees, like dust motes changing their dance in a room where someone has quietly opened a window. In Alleyn's mind, the elements arranged themselves, with the slow inevitability of sediment settling in clear water. A misfolded sheet, a borrowed perfume, an initial that indicated two ghosts at once. A professor with antique ink, a vanished actress who sent a flower in lieu of a signature. Nothing shouted. Everything suggested. He kept his conclusions, such as they were, to himself. What he possessed for the moment was the sensation one has when a familiar room is discovered to be minutely rearranged. Someone, or something, had moved among these lives with a knowledge of their rituals and had set them ever so slightly out of true. By late afternoon, the meridian had resumed its cultivated hush, as though grief, properly acknowledged, might be folded away like a shawl. Alleyn stood alone in the alcove, the pale light making a pearl of the marble plinth and reducing the gilt frame to a dim corona. The painting's sea remained calm, the white figure uncompromised, the sand unmarked. He allowed the scene to compose itself inside him until the human elements, voices, perfumes, rehearsed pauses, thinned to their essences. In the morning, he had walked again through the routines that governed this place, Pemberton's ledger, with its unbroken columns of times and initials, the precise manner in which the velvet rope was always fastened, Pemberton's small ceremony, a double turn and snugging of the brass clip until it kissed the post. The tea tray set on the walnut table where Mrs. Pemberton always left it at 9. 2 cups, one rinsed as if by a hurried hand, the other bearing a faint crescent of lipstick too cool in tone for Vivian's usual coral. Such trifles, perhaps. But trifles, repeated, became custom, custom disturbed, became clue. The rope had been refastened, yes, but not with Pemberton's compact signature. Someone had left a tidy quick-release loop more familiar to dressing rooms and fly towers than to galleries. It would have pleased a stagehand or an actress. And there had been the letter at midday, brought to Lady Cordelia's desk by a footman who said he found it in the outer hall. Typed, unsigned, it purported to be Vivian's farewell. Bloodless phrases, a piety of release, a request that no inquest trouble the memory of Edmund Hartwell. It smelt faintly of roses. Lady Cordelia's nostrils had narrowed almost imperceptibly. Pemberton, shown the envelope, remarked that Miss Castleton always sealed her notes with a mint-green wafer from a Bond Street stationer, while this bore a cheap gummed flap from a tobacconist. Such things announced themselves without noise. Alleyn thought of Dr. Whitfield's careful words, which circled responsibility without alighting. The man had passed along the service corridor at 9:30 carrying his bag. He had keys, access, a reason that would pass in company, a patient's distress. He also had means, if means were required. Yet the scene beneath the painting, its theatrical tidiness, did not read as the work of medicine. It read as composition. Helena Marchmont's fragrance followed her like a reminiscence. Heavy rose with a faint metallic undernote, as if the heart of the flower had carried a pin. She had arrived for her interview composed, but her eyes had strayed to the window as though considering distance. She was a creature of arrangement, of light, of stance, of the shaped utterance. Jealousy? Perhaps. But jealousy alone lacked the patience evident here. Jealousy blurted. This murmured. James Ashford, poor in poetry, if rich in other currencies, had calculated aloud. He knew values, insurance clauses, the way a scandal might deflate or inflate a market. He would not have chosen roses. He would have chosen discretion and speed. Lady Cordelia's poise was a habit of mind. Her kindness had edges. A patron's love can be possessive without intending harm. She knew the exhibition's order, Edmund's narrative. If anything had been arranged to preserve a story, she would have known where to place it. But she would not, Alleyn thought, have risked the odor of a lie so clumsily typed. The locket troubled him. The chain had been snapped with a short, economical force, and yet there were no marks upon the neck. It had been placed, he chose the word deliberately, in Vivian's right hand. He had examined the notes she made in Lady Cordelia's file room, left-handed characters, slanting uphill, firm upon downstrokes. A left-handed woman, when seized by sentiment or stress, would cradle a keepsake in the dominant hand. The right-hand placement suggested a curator of gestures who watched his or her own hands. Then the petal, dried, crushed, inexplicably fresh in presence. A memento carried in a reticule, a prop. Helena's perfume was not made of petals, yet Edmund, on certain sittings, had scattered pressed flowers across a model's lap, calling the little desiccations Time's confetti. Professor Thornton had recorded that in a preface once. Academics notice such litter. Thornton, with his chilly interest in metamorphosis, had not come when summoned. He had sent a note in a narrow hand, begging for the morrow. Alleyn filed that away with the others. Motive, then, if one could approach it sideways. Not simple grief, nor simple greed. Something to do with narrative. Who controlled it? Who belonged inside it? Who had been written out? Eleanor's death was not past. It had been opened like an old letter and read again. Whatever Vivian had found in those files had set a clock running. At 9:30, medicine arrived. Later, how much later he could not yet say, arrangement followed. He let his gaze rest upon the painted girl. No footprints, no declaration. Yet the world she crossed reflected sky with such perfect obedience that any disturbance, however slight, would have flashed upon its surface. He had his disturbances. The wrong rope, the wrong cup, the wrong hand, the wrong letter. He folded them away, one atop another, until the stack had the weight of something like certainty. It was not yet proof. Dust needed time to settle, and people, presented with their own reflections, needed quiet in which to recognize them. Tomorrow would provide both. Alleyn returned to the meridian in the washed light of late afternoon, when the city's noises retreat as if embarrassed by daylight's candor. He had asked that the gallery be closed and the lamps kept low. Paint and varnish breathed their faint incense. The alcove waited, like a stage before the curtain lifts, for the quiet scene he intended. Dr. Whitfield arrived with punctual gravity, his coat brushed free of the day's small entanglements, his medical bag a dark oblong against the pallor of the walls. Pemberton, exact as the quarter hour, admitted him and withdrew, a discreet ripple sinking back into still water. "You wished to walk me through last evening," Whitfield said, keeping his voice on the safe side of professional. "If you please." Alleyn led him to the painting. The velvet rope hung in its accustomed place. The parquet held its immaculate sheen. You had a key for the service door. You entered at 9:30. You left by the same route. Whitfield's eyelids made a motion so slight it might have been a trick of the lamplight. "I did. Miss Castleton had written that she felt unwell and would value my advice. She told Pemberton she expected a visitor with whom she had unfinished business. The phrase is not incompatible with anxiety." "No." Alleyn stood with his hands behind his back, studying the lower molding of the frame. "Did you give her anything?" "A draft she already possessed and rarely used." The doctor's tone was level, but the careful choice of words left a small wake. "I urged moderation." "There were 2 cups on the tray," Alleyn observed. One bore the faintest ring of lavender, the other dried rose, a curious mixture. Miss Marchmont's perfume pervaded the rooms last night. One noticed it everywhere. "In most places," said Alleyn, "perfume disperses. In closed spaces it settles. In this alcove it lingered as though invited." Whitfield's gaze traveled to the plinth and back. "You suggest that scent denotes guilt." "I suggest that ritual denotes intention." Alleyn's finger indicated the brass claw of the rope standard. Miss Castleton always observed rules. She would unhook the rope and, before she sat, hook it back. Someone else would have stepped across. "Then she replaced it," the doctor said almost sharply. "Or someone careful did it for her." Alleyn allowed the silence to replenish itself. "Your bag last night?" "Unopened," Whitfield replied. "I examined her, spoke with her, and left her calmer than I found her. She was alive when I went." "I don't doubt it." Alleyn's voice was as flat and courteous as a well-laid card. "You attended Edmund Hartwell in his last illness." "I did." "And signed the certificate." "Yes." Alleyn turned from the painting at last. Miss Castleton had been reading Lady Cordelia's correspondence for the months preceding her sister's death. She believed that what happened to Eleanor was not accident, but accommodation. She meant to confront someone with her notion. She chose this place because the painting gave her courage. Whitfield looked past him into the painted distance, where the white figure made her unmarked progress across the tide flat. "An unfortunate mind, Inspector. Grief will arrange coincidences into conspiracies." "And yet the coincidences persist," Alleyn said gently. "A sister dead in a crash after a party where certain people drank more than they should. A young woman who cannot cease from mourning, who turns from sedative to clarity, and then, at last, to silence. A physician with keys, accustomed to discretion. The smell of dried roses where roses should not be." Whitfield's hands tightened on the bag's handle until the leather whispered, "You intend to accuse me?" "I intend to ask you to sit, very quietly, in Lady Cordelia's library while I speak to the others. You may find that your presence is either unnecessary or convenient." He gave the smallest of smiles. "In either case, you will be spared the melodrama of protest." The doctor's mouth compressed. After a moment he inclined his head. "As you wish." When Whitfield had gone, Alleyn remained alone with the painting and its silence. He touched the lower frame where, faintly, the gilt bore the print of a finger. The mark had been tidied, almost erased, but not entirely. It was placed not where a seated girl would steady herself, but higher, where a standing person, reaching across, might brace. At Belgravia, in the muffled graciousness of Lady Cordelia's drawing-room, the small company assembled. Lady Cordelia, straight as a metronome. James, restless as a trapped fly. Helena Marchmont, her rose scent gentled by fatigue. Professor Thornton, precise as a theorem. And Pemberton, a quiet axis upon which the household turned. Alleyn took a place that made no statement and waited for the room to compose itself. "We shall be very calm," he said. "There are only a few small matters to set in order." The lamps hummed softly. Beyond the curtains, evening fell with the decorum of an old appointment. They gathered at twilight in the alcove where the painting presided with its inexhaustible calm. Lady Cordelia had asked for quiet. The gallery was closed, the lamps shaded to a gentler glow. Mr. Pemberton stood as ever, a respectful pace behind her chair. Helena Marchmont and James Ashford took places at the perimeter, careful to appear accidental in their choice of distance. Dr. Whitfield entered last. He looked at the picture first, as if seeking in it the permission he could not ask of those present. Alleyn remained standing. He had the air of a man reluctant to disturb a realm's balance, but who knows that disturbance, once made, will be of the smallest possible kind. "I shall be brief," he said. Miss Castleton invited a visitor. She did so openly. She asked for tea for two and that she be left undisturbed. The service door was imperfectly fastened. The velvet rope was unhooked and later replaced with care. She wore lavender. The alcove smelt of roses, heavy and medicinal. There were 2 cups, one lightly stained. The scent lodged more stubbornly in the china than any perfume might have done in air. Helena's hand moved to a delicate chain and then away. "I wore roses," she said, not as denial, but to lay aside an obvious thread. "But you are not speaking of me." "No," said Alleyn gently. "You were seen to leave by the front. The visitor Miss Castleton expected came by the staff entrance at 9:30. He looked at Dr. Whitfield. The physician's gaze did not meet his at once. It went first to Lady Cordelia, then to the painted girl in the tidal light, and only then to the inspector. Miss Castleton had been reading correspondence concerning her sister's death, Alleyn continued. She believed the official account incomplete. She wished to talk of Eleanor and of responsibility. She chose, very properly, to address the man who had signed the certificate. Dr. Whitfield's voice, when it came, was dry and very controlled. She was in a state of agitation. I feared for her health. "You brought a draught," Alleyn said, "a cordial sweetened with rose. It is a common vehicle. It masks bitterness, a routine thing, an old doctor's habit, except for one deviation. You had already been reminded these last weeks of Miss Castleton's intolerance for sedatives. You persisted." James gave a short, involuntary laugh that no one joined. Lady Cordelia's hand settled, light as silk, upon the arm of her chair. She was not hysterical, Alleyn went on. She was resolved. She had pieced together enough to know Eleanor did not die cleanly on a road, but later and bleeding. The road was a convenience and a kindness. Others benefited from that kindness. You, perhaps wrongly, believed yourself the last custodian of it. Dr. Whitfield's shoulders straightened as if under a weight he had finally decided to accept. "I gave her a small dose," he said, "to steady her. She was frail. I misjudged the effect." "Not entirely," Alleyn replied. "You stayed. You replaced what you had unhooked. You arranged what you had disarranged. When her locket chain broke, accidentally when you lifted her head, You put it in her hand, thinking perhaps it would be thought a gesture of, what? Attachment. You left by the same door, closing it badly. A man of ritual, Doctor. You were careful with the rope, less so with the bolt. There was a long, almost courteous silence. The painting accepted it. So, after a moment, did Lady Cordelia. Marcus, she said, and the use of a Christian name did more than any accusation. Was it necessary? He turned to her, and in his face there was no plea for absolution. I had made a decision years ago, he said. I believed it spared you, and James and the dead man who could not defend himself, a public consumption of private mistakes. She was going to break it all open, not for malice, but for purity. I could not bear that purity. It is more ruthless than sin. Helena's breath caught, a small sound. James stared at the floor as if it might, at last, demand something of him. Alleyn inclined his head. You will come with me quietly, Doctor. There is yet the machinery to be observed. You have been considerate of forms. We shall return you that courtesy. Pemberton stepped forward, not as a jailer, but as an usher might at the close of a performance. Dr. Whitfield looked once more at the girl who left no footprints. She asked if the painting lied, he said. I told her, not about her. Nor about you, Alleyn said very softly. They moved without haste through the dim rooms. Behind them, the sea-light girl walked forever on her foreign sand, leaving nothing on the surface, yet altering, by having passed, the quality of the air. They took Dr. Whitfield from Lady Cordelia's morning room at an hour when Belgravia is inclined to tea rather than scandal. No handcuffs, no raised voices, only the muted exchange of civilities among men who knew that ceremony can lessen the sting of consequence. He had signed his statement with a firm, unornamented hand, and looked not so much defeated as relieved, like a physician who has finally named the illness he has long suspected. I did not intend her death, he had said, not as plea but as diagnosis. I intended sleep. She asked for it. Alleyn, who had listened without interruption, offered neither comfort nor condemnation. He had learned that in some matters, the law's clarity could not entirely dispel the mind's twilight. Vivian's last evening had taken its final, inevitable shape. The private appointment, the measured glass, the careful arrangement that transformed a collapse into a tableau. The rose scent, which had seemed so accusatory, proved a red herring. An old scarf of Helena's left behind on the opening night and stuffed by someone into a corner of the alcove to sweeten the draught. It had done its misleading work with the indifferent diligence of all trifles. Lady Cordelia stood by the mantel, hands composed, gaze fixed upon a point somewhere beyond the room's polished surfaces. I asked you to look after her, she said to Whitfield before he went, her tone courteous, almost weary. Not to look away. He bowed his head. I have been looking away for 2 years, Lady Cordelia. There, the true confession. Not the measure of chloral, not the morphia calculated to calm, but the earlier night on a rain-swept road when Eleanor Castleton's breathing had faltered in the back of an ambulance and Whitfield, with the authority of education and habit, had allowed oblivion to arrive without contest. He had called it mercy then. Later, when mercy began to itch like a poorly mended wound, he called it necessity. Now, faced with the smaller tragedy born of the larger, he had no word left that would stand. James Ashford hovered at the periphery, restless with unspent arithmetic. Will there be publicity? He asked Alleyn under his breath, the hush of the house making vulgarity sound like prudence. There will be an inquest, Alleyn replied. Its tone will depend upon the testimony of those who prefer dignity. He did not look at him while speaking. James, who understood the currency of reputation, subsided as if a calculation had momentarily defeated him. Helena Marchmont sat very straight, hands clasped, the perfume that had betrayed nothing now only a faint memory caught in the upholstery. He did love her, she said unexpectedly, eyes on the fire. It was not clear whether she meant Edmund or the doctor, nor perhaps did it matter. The room received the remark with the neutrality of good furniture. Pemberton, summoned for practicalities, entered with the calm that had soothed 100 exhibitions and 12 private catastrophes. He gave Alleyn a look which might have been gratitude, though none of its elements were personal. "We will close the Meridian for a fortnight," he announced to no one in particular. "Paintings repair themselves when no one is watching." Outside, the afternoon relinquished its light with deliberate grace. The city accepted the return of darkness as one receives a familiar visitor who has made a habit of arriving unannounced. Alleyn, preparing to leave, paused at the threshold and regarded Lady Cordelia with a slight inclination of the head. "You will have visitors," he said gently. "Reporters, anxious friends, people who will ask for explanations that can be offered only once, if at all." "I shall tell them," she replied, "that grief is a poor navigator and that some shores cannot be reached by ordinary maps." The line might have been rehearsed. It did not sound so. When the door closed upon the police car's quiet departure, the house experienced that particular stillness which follows the removal of pain by professional means. Not cure, exactly, only the absence of pressure. In the gallery, the girl who left no footprints would continue her impossible walk. Edmund Hartwell's signature remained slender and intact. Value, Sir Reginald would write in due course, had been enhanced by tragedy, as if sorrow were a varnish that deepened color. On the pavement, Alleyn drew in the evening air and allowed his mind to settle. He felt neither triumph nor defeat. A man had been led away, a young woman would not return, an older one had long since gone, and somewhere, in a studio that smelled of spirits and chalk, an artist's last intention had found its cruelest companion: interpretation. Justice would perform its necessary rites. Irony had already completed hers. By late afternoon, the Meridian had resumed its cultivated hush, as though grief, like dust, had been swept to the edges and made presentable. Alleyn asked Dr. Whitfield to walk with him through the empty galleries. They stopped before the alcove where the painting presided. The air retained the faint echo of roses, a sweetness that felt at once deliberate and evasive. "I dislike formality in matters that wish to be spoken quietly," Alleyn said. "Things arranged too perfectly tend to rattle. Last night's arrangements were very nearly perfect." The doctor's profile, refined and familiar, offered nothing. "I was called to comfort a distressed young woman," he replied. "I failed." Alleyn's gaze remained on the gilt frame. "Thomas saw you enter by the service door at 9:30. You replaced the rope with a steady hand, accustomed, I think, to delicate adjustments. The parquet shows no scuffing. She did not struggle. There was tea for two. In her hand, a broken locket, clutched, not torn away. And this scent, dried roses, persistent, not Miss Castleton's lavender." Whitfield's hands closed upon each other like a careful instrument returned to its case. "I brought a sedative," he said. She had become dangerously agitated. It is not unusual in certain preparations to scent the draught. Spirit of roses masks less agreeable notes. "Chloroform?" Alleyn inquired, very gently. "A few drops, enough to soothe." The doctor's voice faltered and recovered. She had a fragile heart. I knew it. I misjudged her tolerance. She spoke rapidly and then, quite suddenly, the pulse became capricious. I waited for it to steady. It did not. The painting's girl moved across the painted shore without trace. Alleyn allowed the silence to lie a moment and then asked, "What was she saying before you sought to quiet her?" Whitfield's reply came in the toneless cadence of a confession properly made. "Eleanor, 2 years ago. A foolish journey, a late night, a car taken without permission. Mr. Ashford at the wheel, a scrape without consequence except for scandal. I adjusted what could be adjusted, precluded the worst of it. prevented a ruinous inquest. Miss Castleton had found letters, unguarded kindnesses from Lady Cordelia and myself, in which the indiscretion is discernible to any eye inclined to look. She meant to force a public reckoning. She had, I think, convinced herself it would restore the dead. And so, last night you asked for time. Yes. He looked at the small, immaculate scene with something that was almost gratitude. She wished to sit beneath this painting. I will not go on, she said, until I have made footprints of my own. She was shaking. I believed a brief oblivion would prevent catastrophe. I've soothed many storms in the same way. I had not intended... He stopped, as if the sentence had reached a precipice and found nothing beyond it. Alleyn inclined his head. You placed her hand upon the frame. She had reached for it and lost strength. I finished the gesture. It seemed kinder. His eyes, tired and exact, sought Alleyn's and did not look away. There is no proper defense. You will fashion the necessary consequences, and I shall submit to them. They returned to Lady Cordelia's morning room, where daylight had thinned to a civilized pallor. She listened without interruption, her face an exercise in composure. James stared at the carpet as if costings were written there. Helena Marchmont stood at the window with her back to the room, roses a mere ghost about her. It will be manslaughter, Alleyn said, almost as if to himself. Staging will not help you. The service key certainly will not. I will make the arrest at once, Doctor. With no parade. Whitfield bowed as though concluding a long, demanding consultation. Thank you. When he had gone with the sergeant, between two breaths as it seemed, Lady Cordelia opened a drawer and laid upon the table a packet of letters bound with narrow ribbon. These will remain unopened by anyone to whom they do not belong, she said. There has been enough theatre. Quite, Alleyn answered. Miss Marchmont's perfume misled us, for a time. It is a habit of roses to meddle. Helena did not reply. Her reflection in the glass looked like a woman pausing between parts. At the last, Alleyn returned to the gallery and stood before the girl on the shore. He thought of Vivian's fixed serenity, of a doctor's fatal kindness, of a patron's quiet authority pressed now into the service of discretion rather than display. Outside, the weather was turning. The lamplighter moved along the street, careful, exact, leaving a measured trail of small, obedient suns. It came to him that footprints do not always declare themselves to sand and tide. Sometimes they exist only in the adjustments people make to their stories. A rope rehung, a door left imperfectly fastened, a scent that lingers when it should have passed. He looked once more at the painted girl and at the unmarred mirror of her path, and then he left the gallery as he had entered it, lightly, so lightly that the dust did not stir.